There is a scene in Jujutsu Kaisen where Satoru Gojo, the most powerful sorcerer alive, shows up to a situation involving a student who could die or kill everyone around him, and decides it is a good moment to show off. He has fun, he makes it entertaining, then he leaves. And somehow, across hundreds of chapters and 2 seasons of television, that pattern never fully changes. Gojo Satoru is one of the most beloved characters in modern anime. He is also, when you actually look at what he built and what he left behind and what happened to the people he was responsible for, one of the most fascinating examples of a mentor who genuinely cared and consistently fell short in the ways that mattered most. This is not a takedown. It is an honest look at a character the fandom adores, including this channel, and what the story actually shows us when we pay close attention. Welcome to Animind. Let us get into it. The strongest sorcerer in the world was a part-time teacher. There is a moment early in Jujutsu Kaisen that tells you everything you need to know about Satoru Gojo as a teacher, if you pay close enough attention to it. Yuji Itadori has just swallowed one of Sukuna's fingers. He is a brand new student who has never been in the Jujutsu world before. He has no training, no knowledge of cursed energy, no understanding of what is happening inside his own body. This should be a 5-alarm emergency for whoever is responsible for him. Instead, Gojo shows up, looks at the situation, and decides this is a great moment to show off. He demonstrates his abilities in front of Megumi Fushiguro. He has fun. He treats the whole thing like an amusing detour in his day, rather than a crisis involving a child who could die or destroy everyone around him at any moment. Then he leaves. That pattern, showing up, making an impression, and then disappearing, is not a one-time thing. It is the shape of Gojo's entire relationship with teaching. Satoru Gojo is, without any question, the most powerful Jujutsu sorcerer alive during the events of Jujutsu Kaisen. His abilities are so far beyond everyone else that even the main villains spend the entire series trying to figure out how to remove him from the board rather than defeat him directly. He is so strong that his mere existence changes the balance of power. Curses grew more powerful over generations specifically because Gojo was born. That is how much his presence alone reshapes the world around him. He is also a teacher at Tokyo Jujutsu High. That second fact tends to get treated like a fun character detail. The most powerful man alive also happens to be a goofy teacher who wears a blindfold and eats too many sweets. But what it actually represents, when you look at it seriously, is one of the most important and most failed responsibilities in the entire story. Gojo chose to become a teacher. He is not there by accident or assignment. He made a deliberate decision, after watching what happened to his best friend Suguru Geto, to reform the Jujutsu world from the ground up by raising a new generation of powerful and trustworthy sorcerers. Teaching was his plan. It was supposed to be his answer to everything wrong with the system he lived inside. The problem is that being a teacher requires actually being there. Gojo is not there, not in any consistent, reliable way. He takes missions that pull him away from the school constantly. He is involved in political battles against the higher-ups of Jujutsu society that consume enormous amounts of his time and attention. He shows up for dramatic moments. The first day, a big fight, a key introduction, and then disappears again, leaving his students to navigate genuinely life-threatening situations with whoever else is available. When Yuji needed someone to teach him how to actually function as a sorcerer on a real mission, it was not Gojo who did it. It was Nanami Kento, a sorcerer who was not even Yuji's assigned teacher, who stepped in to provide the guidance and structure that Gojo had not gotten around to giving. Think about what that means. Yuji Itadori arrives at Jujutsu High as a complete outsider. He has no family background in sorcery. He has no knowledge of cursed techniques, ranking systems, mission protocol, or how cursed energy actually works in practice. He is a blank slate, walking into a world that could kill him on any given Tuesday. The person responsible for his development is Satoru Gojo, and yet it falls to Nanami, a man who initially does not even view Yuji as a person, who has to be convinced by Gojo himself to take Yuji on a mission, to fill in the basic foundational knowledge that Gojo never covered. Nanami is the one who teaches Yuji how to think during a real fight. Nanami is the one who reminds him that he is still a kid and should not be forcing himself to grow up before he is ready. Nanami is the one who provides the reality check and the structure that a student entering a deadly profession actually needs. Gojo's defense, if you are being generous, is that he knew his own limitations as a teacher. He knew that he and Yuji had similar personalities, both fun-loving, both people who needed to be having a good time to stay engaged, and that this made Gojo a poor fit for certain kinds of instruction. He knew Yuji needed someone more grounded, so he passed him to Nanami. In one reading, this looks like self-awareness. In another reading, which is the more honest one, it looks like a man who knew he was not doing his job and outsourced the actual work rather than doing it himself. Because here is the thing about outsourcing the job of teaching a student. The job was yours. You chose it. You chose Yuji specifically. You argued against the higher-ups to keep him alive. You made yourself responsible for this kid. And then, when it came time to actually sit down and teach him the things a sorcerer needs to know to survive, you sent him to someone else. else. Gojo's physical absence from his students' daily lives is not a small gap in his teaching. It is the central problem with his teaching. He built his entire reform plan around the idea of raising a new generation. But raising a generation requires presence. It requires consistent guidance, not just dramatic appearances. It requires being available when a student is confused or scared, not just when the situation has escalated to something interesting enough to hold Gojo's attention. The students who grow the most under Gojo's watch do not grow because of Gojo. They grow through their own battles, their own near-death experiences, and the influence of other people in their lives. Todo is the one who teaches Yuji how to use Divergent Fist properly and pushes him toward Black Flash. Nanami is the one who gives Yuji the emotional grounding to face the reality of killing. Yuta grows through his relationship with Rika and his bonds with his classmates, not through anything Gojo specifically sat down and built with him. The growth happens around Gojo, not because of him. There is a version of Gojo's teaching philosophy that sounds genuinely meaningful. He wants his students to think for themselves. He does not want to produce obedient soldiers who follow orders without questioning them. He saw what happened when the jujutsu system treated young sorcerers as tools to be used, and he decided he would do something different. That intention is real. The problem is that good intentions and good teaching are not the same thing. You cannot want your students to be independent and then not be there to help them build the foundation that independence requires. You cannot claim to be raising the next generation while spending most of your time somewhere else. You cannot be someone's teacher in title and a stranger in practice, and expect the results to be any different from abandonment. Megumi Fushiguro has been connected to Gojo since he was 5 or 6 years old. Gojo discovered Megumi through his dying father, Toji Fushiguro, who mentioned in his final moments that his son would be sold to the Zenin clan. Gojo stepped in, made sure that did not happen, and took Megumi under his wing. That is a decade of connection. A decade of Gojo knowing this boy, watching him grow up, observing what he needed. And in all that time, Gojo managed to produce a student who represses every emotion he has, who makes tactical decisions that amount to volunteering himself to die, and who has no support system for the psychological weight he carries every day. A decade of access to the most powerful sorcerer alive, and Megumi grows up more damaged than most of the people in a world designed to break people. That is not bad luck. That is the result of a specific kind of absence, not just physical, but emotional. Gojo was around enough to ensure Megumi was safe from the Zenin clan. He was not around enough, or available enough, or willing enough to look at what Megumi actually needed beyond that. He was present for the dramatic rescue and absent for the quiet daily work of caring for a child. The argument that gets made for Gojo is that he loves his students. This is true. Gojo genuinely cares about the young people he is responsible for. He fought the higher-ups repeatedly to keep them alive. He chose to become a teacher specifically to protect the next generation from what he went through. His love for his students is not in question. But love is not a teaching method. Caring about someone does not automatically translate into knowing how to guide them, being present for them, or giving them what they actually need rather than what you assume they need based on your own experience. A parent can love their child deeply and still fail them. A mentor can care about their students sincerely and still not be there when it matters. Gojo's failure as a teacher is not a failure of heart. It is a failure of presence, consistency, and follow-through. He chose teaching as his method for changing the world. He was not willing to be fully a teacher. He wanted the mission without doing the work that the mission actually required every single day. And his students paid for that gap in ways that become clearer and more painful the further the story goes. The most honest way to describe Gojo Satoru's teaching career is this. He showed up for the moments that felt significant, left his students to figure out everything else, and told himself that surviving everything else was the lesson. Sometimes surviving is a lesson, but a 15-year-old in a world that is actively trying to kill them deserves more than a teacher who treats neglect as a form of instruction. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Being physically absent is one problem, but Gojo's teaching had a deeper issue underneath the disappearing acts, one that had nothing to do with where he was and everything to do with how he thought about what he was actually passing on to the people in his care. Because when Gojo did teach, what he taught was himself, and that created a different kind of damage entirely. Section 2. He mistook power for curriculum. There is a specific kind of teacher that every student eventually encounters. They know their subject better than almost anyone alive. They can do things in their field that make your jaw drop, and when they try to explain how they do it, they look at you with genuine confusion. Not because they are mean, but because they have been doing it so long and so naturally that they genuinely cannot remember what it felt like to not know. They have forgotten what the beginning looks like. They have forgotten that other people do not start where they ended up. Satoru Gojo is that teacher. Except the subject is not math or history. It is surviving a world that will kill you if you make a single mistake at the wrong moment. When Yuji Itadori enters Jujutsu High, he enters with nothing. He has no background in sorcery, no family that taught him about cursed energy, no older older sibling who explained the basics over dinner. He is a completely normal high school student who happened to swallow a cursed finger belonging to the most dangerous being in the history of the jujutsu world. And now he is enrolled in a school that trains people to fight monsters, surrounded by classmates who have been preparing for this life since childhood. He is starting from zero in a place where everyone else is already running. The person assigned to guide him through this is Satoru Gojo, the strongest sorcerer alive. A man who has never, at any point in his life that the story shows us, struggled with cursed energy. A man who was born with two of the rarest and most powerful abilities in the entire jujutsu world. A man who, by his own admission, has essentially mastered everything there is to master in his field. He is so far beyond his students in raw ability that he once stood in front of a group of special grade curses, the most dangerous category of threat in the series, and treated it as light entertainment. He was not afraid. He was barely paying attention. Now take that person and ask them to teach a 15-year-old who does not know what cursed energy is yet. What Gojo does with Yuji early in the series is not nothing. He does give him a starting point. He introduces Yuji to the concept of cursed energy and gives him a basic method for beginning to develop it, the movie-watching exercises, where Yuji has to maintain his focus while being distracted by something he enjoys. The thinking behind this is actually reasonable. Gojo understands that Yuji is someone who needs stimulation to stay engaged, and he designs an early exercise around that personality. In that narrow sense, Gojo is paying attention to who his student is, but that is where the curriculum ends. Everything beyond that first layer, the practical knowledge a sorcerer needs to survive a real mission, the understanding of how different threats work, the tactical thinking required when you are standing in front of something that wants to kill you and you have 3 seconds to make a decision, Gojo does not cover. He moves on. He either assumes Yuji will figure it out through experience, or he genuinely does not think about it, or he considers it below the level of instruction worth his time. So Yuji goes on his first real mission without that knowledge, and when the gaps become life-threatening, it is Nanami who fills them, not Gojo. Nanami Kento is a grade 1 sorcerer. He is serious, structured, and deeply committed to doing his job with precision. He is also not Yuji's teacher. He has no assigned responsibility toward Yuji. He is brought in by Gojo specifically because Gojo recognizes, to his credit, that he himself is not providing what Yuji needs. Nanami provides the field education. He teaches Yuji how to read a situation. He explains how cursed spirits work in a way that can actually be applied in the moment. He treats Yuji with a kind of steady, grounded seriousness that tells Yuji his life matters, and the decisions he makes matter, and the world he is operating in has rules that he needs to understand if he is going to survive it. Nanami also tells Yuji, plainly and directly, that he is still a kid, that he should not force himself to grow up faster than he has to, that the weight of this world is real and heavy, and Yuji does not need to pretend otherwise. That is a profoundly important thing to say to a teenager who has just been handed an execution sentence by the highest authority in jujutsu society and told to spend his life eating cursed fingers until he has collected enough of them to justify keeping him alive. Someone needed to say that to Yuji. Gojo did not say it. Nanami did. What makes this more than just a gap in lesson planning is what it reveals about how Gojo thinks about teaching in the first place. Gojo does not see teaching as the careful, patient process of building a student up from where they actually are. He sees it as a process of exposure. Throw people at hard enough situations, and the ones with real ability will develop it. The experience itself is the curriculum. The near-death moments are the lessons. There is a version of that philosophy that has some truth in it. Pressure does produce growth in the jujutsu world. The series makes that clear over and over. Moments of genuine crisis push characters to levels they could not reach through calm practice. Black Flash, the most powerful strike a sorcerer can produce, cannot be taught or practiced deliberately. It only happens in the heat of real combat, when the conditions are just right. Gojo knows this. He understands that there are things about being a sorcerer that can only be learned by doing, but understanding that pressure produces growth is not the same as believing that pressure is all you need. Before you throw someone into the deep end, they need to know how to move their arms. They need to know what the deep end looks like. They need to understand the basic mechanics of what they are doing, or the pressure does not produce growth, it just produces drowning. Yuji's cursed energy technique in his early missions is called Divergent Fist. It is a method of striking that actually works against him. The way Yuji uses it, the cursed energy arrives at the point of impact a fraction of a second after the physical punch, which means he is landing 2 hits, but neither of them is as powerful as a clean single hit would be. It is a habit born out of not being properly taught how cursed energy and physical movement are supposed to work together. It is the kind of technical problem a good teacher would identify early and correct before it becomes a pattern. Gojo identifies it and does not correct it. He tells Yuji to keep going with it because, at that stage, it is the best option available given where Yuji is in his development. And there is a logic to that decision in isolation. But leaving it there, never circling back, never building Yuji towards something better, that is where the logic runs out. The habit stays days until Todo, who is not Yuji's teacher and is technically from a rival school, pushes Yuji through a brutal series of black flash moments that force his body to find a better way. Todo accomplishes in one afternoon of crisis what Gojo, across months of being Yuji's assigned mentor, never got around to addressing. This is the pattern. Gojo either does not address the foundational gaps in his students' training, or he addresses them just enough to keep them functional and then moves on, trusting that the gap will fill itself eventually through experience. The problem is that experience alone is a wildly inefficient teacher. Experience without guidance is just repeated exposure to the possibility of failure. Sometimes failure teaches you, sometimes it just kills you. In the jujutsu world, the margin for error is not a margin at all. The consequences of not knowing something are not a bad grade. They are death, or something worse than death. Gojo's approach to training comes directly from his own experience of getting stronger. He nearly died in his second year of high school during the Star Plasma Vessel mission. He was defeated by Toji Fushiguro in a way that should have killed him, and it was that near-death experience, that moment of total helplessness, that unlocked the deeper level of his abilities and made him what he eventually became. The crisis was his turning point. So his teaching is built around manufacturing crises for his students and trusting that the same thing will happen to them that happened to him. What he does not account for is that his turning point was possible because he already had an extraordinary foundation before Toji broke him. He had spent years developing the abilities he was born with to a genuinely high level before that mission. The crisis built on top of a structure that was already there. His students often do not have that structure. He is trying to recreate the turning point without first building what the turning point needs to turn on top of. He is skipping the foundation and going straight to the breakthrough, hoping the breakthrough will create its own foundation on the way down. It also does not account for the fact that he is Satoru Gojo. He was born with abilities that no one else in 400 years has possessed at the same time. When he nearly died at 17, he survived because he had a specific kind of power that allowed him to reprocess his own technique in a way that essentially made him impossible to harm. His students do not have that. What works as a crucible for someone born the way Gojo was born does not automatically translate to a useful teaching philosophy for teenagers who do not share his particular gifts. Yuta Okotsu is introduced to Jujutsu High with essentially no explanation of what the school is, what is expected of him, or what the path forward looks like. Gojo enrolls him without a real orientation. This is partly because Yuta's situation is unusual. He is not a typical student. He is a boy with a powerful and uncontrollable cursed spirit attached to him, and the priority is getting him somewhere he can be managed and developed. But the lack of any real foundational guidance leaves Yuta stumbling through his early time at the school without a clear understanding of where he is or what he is supposed to become. He grows because of his bonds with his classmates and the painful process of confronting his relationship with Rika. The growth comes from the emotional work, not from structured instruction. A teacher who is producing results only when other factors are doing the actual teaching is not really the reason for the results. Gojo gets credit for his students' growth the way a gardener gets credit for rain. He was present. He created some of the conditions, but the water came from somewhere else. What Gojo could not see, and what becomes painfully clear as the story moves forward, is that his students needed more than power. They needed knowledge. They needed structure. They needed someone who could sit down with them, figure out where exactly they were, and build from that specific place toward where they needed to go. Gojo gave them proximity to greatness and called it a curriculum. He gave them survival situations and called them lessons. He gave them the impression that power was the answer to everything, because in his experience, power had been the answer to almost everything. Quote, _1, _. The damage that philosophy does to his students shows up not just in their technical weaknesses, but in who they become. And nowhere is that damage clearer than in the student Gojo spent the most time with, the one he poured the most intention into shaping, and the one who ends up the most quietly broken of all. Section 3. He cloned himself instead of developing his students. Gojo took Megumi Fushiguro under his wing when Megumi was 5 or 6 years old. That is not a small number. That is almost a decade of influence before Megumi even enters Jujutsu High as a first-year student. A decade of Gojo being the most significant adult figure in Megumi's life. A decade of Gojo knowing this boy, watching him grow, understanding what makes him tick and what breaks him down, and what he needs to keep going. If there is any student in the entire series that Gojo had the time, the access, and the information to truly get right, it is Megumi Fushiguro. He had more runway with Megumi than any teacher has a right to ask for. The result of that decade is a teenager who cannot cry in front of other people, who volunteers himself to die when he calculates that the trade is mathematically worth it, who has no real way to process loss when it arrives, except to shut it down and keep moving, who carries the weight of everyone around him as his personal responsibility and has no framework for putting any of it down. A decade, with the strongest person alive as his mentor. mentor. And this is where Megumi lands. To understand why, you have to understand what Gojo actually did with all that time. Because it was not neglect in the traditional sense. Gojo did not ignore Megumi. He paid attention to him. He had expectations for him. He thought about Megumi's future with genuine care. The problem was not that Gojo was absent from Megumi's life the way he was absent from the classroom. The problem was what he was present for, and what he was doing with that presence. Gojo saw Megumi and recognized something familiar. Megumi has the 10 Shadows technique, one of the most powerful abilities in the Jujutsu world, passed down through the Fushiguro family line. He is serious and perceptive far beyond his age. He has a kind of quiet intensity that reads, to someone like Gojo, as enormous potential waiting to be unlocked. And Gojo, who has spent his entire life being told he is extraordinary and carrying the weight of that label, looked at Megumi and saw a version of himself. Not an identical version, but a recognizable one. Someone who could be shaped into something that matched what Gojo understood greatness to look like. So that is what he tried to do. He spent 10 years, in small ways and large ones, pushing Megumi toward becoming harder, more self-contained, more willing to make cold decisions, more capable of separating his feelings from his choices. These are things Gojo himself learned to do, or more accurately, things Gojo taught himself to do as a way of surviving a world that had used him as a weapon since childhood. For Gojo, emotional detachment was adaptive. It was a coping method that allowed him to function at an extraordinary level, without being destroyed by the things he experienced. What he failed to understand is that a coping method developed by one specific person, in response to one specific set of experiences, in possession of one specific type of power, does not automatically transfer to someone else as wisdom. Megumi is not Gojo. He does not have Gojo's particular kind of power, the kind that creates an almost physical distance between its user and the world. He does not have Gojo's particular kind of confidence, the bedrock certainty that comes from being undefeated for essentially your entire life. He does not have Gojo's emotional starting point, which, for all its damage, was built around a person who genuinely believed in his own superiority at every moment. Megumi is someone who, at his core, is kind. He saved Yuji Itadori before he had any logical reason to. He told Gojo directly that he did not want Yuji to be executed. His instinct, when left to itself, bends toward protecting people because he cares about them, not because the math adds up. But Gojo's influence pushes him away from that instinct. Across 10 years of being told, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, that strength is what matters, and that emotion is something to be managed rather than felt, Megumi develops a pattern of making decisions that look tactical and are actually self-destructive. He frames suicidal choices as logical ones. He decides to use his most dangerous technique, the one that could kill him, against a single opponent during the Goodwill event. Not because it is the only option, but because he has been trained to prioritize the outcome over his own survival. He has learned to think about himself the way Gojo thinks about the sorcerers around him, as a piece on a board, useful until it is not. The cruelty of this is that Gojo does not intend it. The article about Megumi and Gojo's relationship makes this plain. Gojo genuinely wants the best for Fushiguro. He genuinely cares about this boy. He sees potential in him and wants that potential realized. His intentions are good in the truest sense, but forcing a student into your own shape because you see yourself in them is not the same as developing that student. It is the same as looking at a mirror and deciding the reflection needs a little adjusting. What Megumi needed, and what Gojo could not give him, was someone who saw Megumi as Megumi, rather than as a potential continuation of Gojo. He needed a mentor who looked at his specific personality, the kindness, the sense of responsibility, the way he relates to other people, and built a path forward that worked with those qualities, rather than trying to sand them down into something more Gojo-shaped. He needed someone who understood that you can be strong without being cold, that you can make hard decisions without deciding that your own life is expendable, that the Jujutsu world is brutal, yes, but being brutal back to yourself is not the same thing as strength. Gojo also cannot give Megumi emotional support in any meaningful sense, because Gojo does not have a real model for what that looks like. His own childhood was spent being treated as a weapon by the people who held authority over him. He was separated from his parents and trained to develop his abilities. He was designated a special grade sorcerer and placed in situations no child should be placed in. Nobody protected him or sat with him in his pain. What he learned to do instead was become so strong that the pain could not reach him, and so self-sufficient that he did not need anyone to sit with him anyway. He built a wall and called it character. When he becomes a teacher, he replicates that structure, not consciously, not out of cruelty, but because it is the only structure he knows from the inside. He does not know what it looks like to be a young person with enormous responsibility, who also has someone genuinely meeting them in their fear and confusion and helping them carry it, because no one ever did that for him. You cannot teach what you have never seen modeled. You cannot give your students an emotional safety net that you yourself herself never had and never learned to build. The gap this creates in Megumi's development is not subtle. It shows up in how he fights. It shows up in how he relates to Yuji and Nobara, people he genuinely cares about but struggles to be open with. It shows up in his relationship with his sister Tsumiki, which he carries almost entirely alone, in silence, with no one to help him figure out how to hold that weight without it crushing him. He protects the people around him. He cannot let them protect him back. That is not a personality quirk. That is a pattern taught by a decade of being shaped by someone who also could not be protected. The comparison to how Gojo treats Yuji makes this even clearer. With Yuji, Gojo is looser. There is genuine playfulness between them. Gojo and Yuji have fun together, pull pranks, share the kind of easy warmth that comes from two people who simply enjoy each other's company. Gojo never tries to turn Yuji into himself because Yuji is so clearly his own person that there is no foothold for that kind of shaping. What you see with Yuji and Gojo is actually closer to what a good mentorship could look like. Two people with complementary energies finding a natural rhythm. But with Megumi, Gojo cannot help himself. He sees the potential. He sees the seriousness. He sees someone who could be great in a specific way that Gojo understands and values. And so, he pushes and shapes and holds Megumi to a standard that is essentially Gojo's own standard, translated down to a teenage boy with a completely different internal life. There is a moment that captures this perfectly. Gojo, even in private conversations with Megumi, makes a point of reminding him that he has the potential to one day surpass Gojo himself. On the surface, this reads as encouragement. Look how highly he thinks of his student. Look how much he believes in him. But think about what that statement actually does to a teenager who is already carrying more than he should. It does not just set a high bar. It sets Gojo himself as the bar. It tells Megumi that the measurement of his success is how close he gets to becoming the most powerful person alive. The ceiling of Megumi's ambition is set at Gojo's floor. That is not encouragement. That is pressure wearing encouragement's clothes. The relationship is always professional between them, in a way it never quite is between Gojo and Yuji. They care about each other. That is clear and real. But there is a distance that never fully closes, and that distance is the shape of Gojo's expectation. He has never quite been able to see Megumi as just a kid who needs to be cared for, rather than a future weapon who needs to be prepared. Because that is the frame Gojo operates inside. People are either strong enough to matter, or still becoming strong enough to matter. Feelings are either fuel for that process, or obstacles to it. Megumi grows up to be an extraordinarily powerful sorcerer. He develops his technique to a level that even Sukuna, the series' main villain, recognizes as valuable enough to want for himself. By the cold measure of combat ability, Gojo produced a remarkable result. The machinery worked. The person inside the machinery paid a price that the series makes you feel in your chest every time you watch Megumi make a choice that values everyone else's life over his own, and does not seem to notice that there is anything wrong with that. Good teaching does not just produce strong people. It produces people who can carry their strength without it eating them alive. Gojo gave Megumi the strength and forgot the second half. He built a sorcerer and missed the person who was supposed to live inside that sorcerer for the rest of his life. Quote, _2__. And if this is what a decade of direct and intentional mentorship produced, it raises a different and darker question. Because Gojo's most catastrophic failure as a mentor did not happen in a classroom or during a training session. It happened years before he ever became a teacher, with the one person he was closest to in the world, the one person whose collapse he was in the best position to prevent, and the one person he was too far away from, in every way that mattered, to save. Section 4. His individualist philosophy left his students dangerously isolated. There is a scene during the Kyoto Goodwill event that most people remember for the action. Two schools, a surprise attack by real cursed spirits in the middle of what was supposed to be a supervised competition, students fighting for their lives while the adults scramble to respond. It is one of the more intense sequences in the first season, and it works as action because the danger feels real and the stakes feel personal. But there is something else happening in that sequence that is easy to miss if you are focused on who wins the fights. Watch the Tokyo students, Yuji, Megumi, and Nobara, and notice how they move. They split up constantly. They each find themselves alone or in small groupings, facing threats that are genuinely above their level. They handle their individual situations with courage and resourcefulness. And when things get too heavy, when the weight of what they are facing becomes more than one person should carry, they do not reach for each other. They push through alone. They overestimate what they can handle, push past the point where asking for help would have been the smart choice, and absorb the consequences in silence. Now watch the Kyoto students. They are not the heroes of the story. Some of them have been ordered to do things during this event that are genuinely wrong. But notice what they can do that the Tokyo students cannot. They cry in front of each other. When Miwa hits her lowest point, her classmates are there. They do not make her pretend she is fine. They do not expect her to absorb her pain quietly and keep performing. They hold her up. They function as a group in the emotional sense, not just the tactical one. The Tokyo students are stronger individually. The Kyoto students are stronger together. That gap did not appear by accident. It was built, one lesson at a time, by the philosophy of the person responsible for shaping how the Tokyo first years understand themselves and their place in the world. Gojo's core belief about strength is this: a person needs to be capable of surviving and succeeding on their own. Independence is not just a goal, it is the goal. He wants his students to be able to function without relying on anyone else, because he grew up in a world where relying on anyone else was a liability. He learned early that the jujutsu world does not reward softness, and that people you count on can disappear. Through death, through change, through the kind of slow drift that happens when two people stop being able to fully see each other. His response to that world was to become someone who needed nothing from anyone. Someone whose power was so complete and so internal that no external support was required. He then tried to teach that response to his students. The problem is that Gojo's self-sufficiency is built on a foundation that his students do not have. He is the strongest person alive. He has never lost in any fight that the series shows us before Shibuya. His confidence in his own ability is not arrogance in the empty sense. It is based on a lifetime of evidence that he can handle whatever is put in front of him. When Gojo operates alone, he does so from a position of genuine invincibility. When his students operate alone, they do so from a position of being teenagers who are still developing and who face threats that are absolutely capable of killing them. What self-sufficiency looks like for Gojo and what it looks like for a 15-year-old who has been a sorcerer for a few months are completely different things. But Gojo does not fully account for that difference. He teaches the philosophy without adjusting for the gap. He hands his students a framework for living that was built for someone with his specific level of power and expects it to serve them in their current condition. Yuji Itadori is the clearest example of where this falls apart. Yuji is someone who runs toward connection naturally. He wants to be around people. He wants to protect people. He feels things deeply and openly, and does not have much of a filter between what he feels and what he does with it. His instinct, in almost every situation, is to take the weight himself so that the people around him do not have to carry it. He volunteers himself for the hardest moments because he cannot stand watching others suffer when he has the ability to step in. Under Gojo's influence, that natural instinct gets pushed further and further toward a dangerous extreme. Yuji already has a tendency to absorb pain alone. Gojo's philosophy of individual strength does not correct that tendency. It reinforces it. It tells Yuji, in the language of how Gojo operates and what Gojo values, that the right move is always to handle things yourself. That needing help is a weakness to be worked through, not a reality to be managed wisely. That the measure of your worth as a sorcerer is what you can do when you are standing alone. So Yuji runs off on his own. He takes on fights that are above him. He loses to Choso in a situation where the outcome of that loss is devastating, not just physically, but psychologically. He carries guilt in quantities that would flatten most people, and he carries it privately, in the way his mentor taught him to carry things, which is to say, mostly without putting any of it down. Megumi's version of this is even starker. He has been absorbing the idea that individual strength is the primary value for a decade longer than Yuji has. His self-sacrificing tactical decisions, choosing to use techniques that could kill him, framing his own survival as negotiable, are the logical end point of a philosophy that says the strongest outcome matters more than the cost to the person achieving it. He has internalized Gojo's framework so completely that he no longer notices it is operating. It just feels like how he thinks. Nobara Kugisaki does not have the same depth of access to Gojo as her two classmates, but she exists inside the same training environment, absorbs the same values through proximity, and shows the same pattern. Fighting alone when fighting together would be smarter, absorbing her experiences without adequate support, running right up to the edge of what she can handle before she lets anyone see that the edge is there. The thing that makes this particularly painful is that the Tokyo students do genuinely care about each other. This is not a group of people who are emotionally disconnected or who do not want connection. Yuji and Nobara build a real warmth between them. Megumi, for all his guardedness, acts to protect both of them in moments that reveal how much he actually values them. The care is there. What is missing is the ability to show that care to each other in the moments when it would help most. When one of them is struggling and needs to be held up rather than expected to keep walking. The Kyoto students manage this better not because they are kinder people, but because their environment has not specifically trained them away from it. The Tokyo students are trained, in the precise sense of the word, to see needing support as something to push through rather than something to reach for. That training has a name. It is Gojo Satoru's teaching philosophy. What a genuinely good teaching environment would have built is something more complete. Individual strength and the ability to work as a group are not opposites. The strongest units in any kind of conflict are made of strong individuals who also know how to function together, who can communicate under pressure, who can ask for help without it meaning they have failed, who can hold hold each other up when one of them is going down, without the one going down feeling like they have let everyone else down by being human. That combination is more powerful than any single person operating in isolation, no matter how good that person is. Gojo cannot build that combination because he does not fully believe in it. His own experience of being genuinely stronger than everyone around him means that for most of his life, other people in the fight have been a variable he manages rather than a resource he draws on. He is so far above everyone that cooperation, for him, has never really been necessary. He does not need a team, he is the team. His power is so total that the question of how to work with others effectively has simply never been a survival question for him the way it is for his students. So he does not teach it. He teaches what he knows, which is how to be strong inside yourself. He teaches his students to trust their own abilities, to push their own limits, to carry their own weight. Those are real and valuable lessons in the right dose. In the dose Gojo provides, without the counterbalance of teaching them how to function as a connected unit, they produce people who are genuinely powerful and genuinely alone in a world that is genuinely trying to destroy them. There is a moment that crystallizes this. After Yuji goes through one of the most psychologically devastating experiences in the series, a stretch of events that would break most people open, he does not fall apart in front of the people who care about him. He pushes forward. He smiles where smiling is possible. He performs being okay with a kind of heartbreaking commitment to not being a burden. He is doing exactly what his environment has taught him to do. He is being strong individually because that is the version of strength he has been given. Todo Aoi, who is not a Tokyo student and who operates under a completely different set of influences, is the one who actually reaches Yuji in the moments when Yuji cannot reach himself. It is Todo who shows up when Yuji has given up and pulls him back not through a lesson about individual strength, but through the sheer force of choosing to be in Yuji's corner unconditionally. The bond matters. The presence matters. The fact that someone else has decided Yuji is worth showing up for, even when Yuji has stopped believing that himself, that is what saves him. Not a lesson Gojo taught, something Gojo's teaching never quite made room for. Individualism, taken to the extreme that Gojo teaches it, does not produce strength. It produces isolation dressed up as strength. And isolation, in a world where every fight could be your last and the people you care about are always at risk, is not a philosophy. It is a wound that walks around acting like a feature. What Gojo never fully grasped is that his students were not operating in the same world he was operating in. They were in a world where they genuinely needed each other, not as a weakness, not as a fallback, but as an essential part of how they survive and stay human while surviving. He could not see that world clearly because he had never needed to live in it, and that blindness had consequences that went far beyond how his students fought in the field. _quote_3__. Because as damaging as Gojo's teaching philosophy was to the young people directly in his care, it was always in service of something larger, a plan to change the jujutsu world that he had decided his students were the instrument for. And the moment you start seeing the people you are responsible for as instruments for your own goals, the definition of what you owe them changes in ways that are very hard to come back from. Section 5. He used his students as instruments for his own reform agenda. Before Gojo ever stepped into a classroom, before he ever took Megumi under his wing, or argued with the higher-ups about keeping Yuji alive, he made a decision. That decision was not about teaching. It was about power. Specifically, it was about how to use his power to change a system he believed was rotten from the inside out. The jujutsu world that Gojo grew up in is genuinely broken. That part is not in dispute. The higher-ups who run jujutsu society are corrupt, self-serving, and willing to sacrifice young sorcerers without a second thought when it suits their interests. They ordered the death of Riko Amanai, a child, as a matter of institutional policy. They tried to execute Yuji Itadori the moment he became inconvenient. They tried to execute Yuta Okotsu before he had done anything wrong at all. They eventually ordered the death of Principal Yaga, the man who ran Jujutsu High, because his connection to Gojo made him a political liability. These are not people running a good system with a few flaws. These are people running a system built on control, fear, and the willingness to destroy anyone who threatens their authority. Gojo sees all of this clearly. He has seen it since he was a student himself, and his response to it is one of the things that makes him genuinely admirable as a character. He does not accept the system. He does not work quietly within it to preserve his own comfort. He uses his position, the fact that he is too powerful to be removed, as a shield for the people the system wants to destroy. He forces the higher-ups to keep Yuji alive. He refuses to execute Yuta. He protects his students from institutional decisions that would kill them because they are inconvenient. That resistance is real and meaningful. But the reason Gojo becomes a teacher is not purely protective. The protection is real, but it sits inside a larger plan that is about something else entirely. Gojo's stated goal, the one that drives his decision to teach, is to reform the jujutsu world from the bottom up. He looks at the corrupt people running the system and and concludes, correctly, that killing them would not solve anything. New corrupt people would simply take their place. The structure would reproduce the problem. So his solution is generational. He will raise a new generation of sorcerers, people who are powerful enough to eventually replace the current leadership, who share his values rather than the values of the people currently in charge, and who will, over time, remake the system into something better. That is the plan, and his students are the plan. This is where the line between mentorship and instrumentalization gets crossed, and it gets crossed so smoothly that it is easy to miss entirely. Gojo does not see his students as tools in the crude sense. He genuinely cares about them. He is not cynically using young people as pawns without any regard for their well-being, but he does see them from the very beginning in terms of what they will eventually become and what that becoming will accomplish for the larger project he has decided his life is in service of. When Gojo decides to keep Yuji alive rather than letting him be executed after the initial incident with Sukuna's finger, the reasoning he gives is that Yuji can consume all of Sukuna's fingers and give sorcerers a controlled way to handle the most dangerous cursed object in existence. That is a practical, strategic calculation. It is not wrong, the calculation is sound, but it means that Yuji's life is being preserved, at least in part, because Yuji is useful. His survival serves a purpose beyond just the fact that he is a person who deserves to live. Gojo also takes Megumi on specifically because he recognizes Megumi's potential and wants to ensure that potential develops in a direction that serves the future Gojo is trying to build. He says directly, in conversations about Megumi, that he hopes Megumi will grow strong enough to one day rival him. That hope is genuine. But what it reveals is that Gojo's investment in Megumi is always partly about what Megumi will become, and what that becoming will mean for the larger world, not just about who Megumi is right now. Yuta Okotsu is brought into Jujutsu High because Gojo sees his enormous potential and believes he can be shaped into one of the pillars of the next generation. Gojo protects Yuta from execution, yes, but he also immediately begins placing Yuta in situations designed to accelerate his development toward the kind of power that will matter in the larger conflict Gojo is preparing for. The protection and the instrumentalization happen at the same time, which makes them hard to separate and even harder to object to. None of this means Gojo is a villain. It means he is a person with a mission who made his students part of that mission before he fully considered what that would cost them. The cost shows up in what Gojo prioritizes when decisions have to be made. When there is a conflict between what would be best for an individual student and what would serve the larger goal, Gojo consistently, if not always consciously, leans toward the larger goal. Keeping Yuji alive is not just about Yuji. It is about the fingers and the plan. Pushing Megumi toward greater power is not just about Megumi flourishing. It is about producing the kind of sorcerer who can eventually lead the next generation. The welfare of the student is real, but it is not the only thing on the scale. And the other thing on the scale is enormous and deeply personal to Gojo in a way that makes it very hard for him to put it down, even when he should. There is something almost painful about watching Gojo interact with his students in the early parts of the series if you hold this in mind. He genuinely lights up around them. He enjoys them. He finds real joy in their company in a way that feels unguarded and true. He is not performing affection for them. It is real. And underneath that real affection is a framework that has already decided what these young people are for before they ever had the chance to decide it themselves. A student who is also an instrument for someone else's agenda faces a specific kind of pressure that is different from normal academic or training pressure. Normal pressure says, get better because getting better is good for you, because you will be safer and more capable and more able to live the life you want to live. Agenda pressure says, get better because the plan requires it, because other people are counting on the version of you that is fully developed, because there is something larger than your individual life that your individual life is in service of. Yuji feels this pressure most acutely because his situation makes it most explicit. He is told early and often that his purpose is to die a good death after collecting and containing Sukuna's fingers. His entire existence in the Jujutsu world is framed, from the very beginning, around what he is useful for. He is not brought in as a student who happens to have an unusual situation. He is brought in as a solution to a problem. His training is in service of that solution. His survival is in service of that solution. And Gojo, for all his genuine affection for Yuji, is the architect of that framing. Yuji handles this with extraordinary grace. He accepts the framing without much resistance. He decides, on his own terms, that dying after giving everyone a proper death is a goal worth living toward. He takes something that was handed to him as an external purpose and makes it genuinely his own. That is a remarkable thing about Yuji as a person, but it does not change what was handed to him or who handed it. The deeper problem with using students as instruments for a reform agenda is that it creates a dynamic where the teacher cannot fully prioritize the student's development over the mission's requirements. A genuine mentor asks, what does this person need to become the best version of themselves? What do they want? What kind of life are they trying to build? What is in their deepest interest, separate from what I am hoping they will will accomplish. Gojo cannot ask those questions cleanly because his answers are already partially decided by the plan. What his students need to become, in his framework, is powerful enough to change the jujutsu world. That is the destination. Everything else is secondary. The path might be shaped around individual personalities and needs, but the destination does not shift based on what any individual student actually wants for their own life. There is a version of this that every teacher faces. Education is always partly about preparing people for a world that exists outside the classroom, and that preparation involves some degree of shaping toward external goals. A teacher who only ever asked what a student wanted right now, with no thought to what they would need later, would not be a better teacher. They would be an irresponsible one. The tension between individual flourishing and preparation for the larger world is real, and there is no version of teaching that escapes it entirely. But Gojo's version of this tension is more extreme than normal, because the stakes of his agenda are more extreme than normal. He is not preparing students for a job market or a career path. He is preparing them for a generational battle to restructure a corrupt and deadly institution. The size of that goal means the gap between what is good for the individual student and what serves the mission can become very large, very fast, in ways that ordinary teaching tensions never approach. And when that gap opens up, Gojo does not always choose the student. He chooses the mission. Not always, not brutally, but consistently enough that it shapes what his students become and what they believe their lives are for. The most honest version of Gojo's teaching career is this. He was a man with a genuine and important goal who decided that raising a new generation was the path to that goal, and who then spent years building relationships with young people that were always partly about that goal rather than purely about those young people. The love was real. The care was real. The plan was also always real, running underneath everything, shaping what he asked for and what he gave, and what he ultimately prioritized when things got hard. His students deserved someone whose only agenda was them. They got someone whose agenda was the world, with them inside it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That gap between what they deserved and what they got becomes most visible not in anything Gojo did during his time as a teacher, but in something that happened years before any of them enrolled. Because the clearest proof that Gojo's way of caring for people leaves the most critical things uncovered is not in a classroom or a mission. It is in the story of the one person Gojo was closest to in the world. The one who fell apart slowly, in plain sight, while Gojo was looking in a slightly different direction. And by the time Gojo looked back, there was nothing left to save. Section 6. He let Suguru Geto fall, and then repeated the pattern. There is a version of Gojo Satoru's story that gets told a lot, and it goes like this. Gojo tried his best with Suguru Geto, but some things cannot be saved. Geto made his own choices. The jujutsu world broke him in ways that nobody could have predicted or prevented. Gojo did what he could, and when it was not enough, he carried that grief forward and tried to make sure it never happened again by becoming a teacher and protecting the next generation. That version is comforting. It lets Gojo off the hook in a way that his actual behavior does not quite support. The real version is harder to sit with. The real version is that Gojo watched his closest friend deteriorate over years in ways that were visible if you were paying attention, and was too isolated inside his own growing power to see it clearly until it was already too late. And then, after losing Geto in the most painful way imaginable, he became a teacher and built a system with his students that had the same structural gap that cost him Geto in the first place. Suguru Geto and Satoru Gojo attend Jujutsu High together as second-year students. At this point in their lives, they are considered the two strongest students the school has. They are close in a way that the story treats as genuinely rare, not just as friends, but as equals, which in Gojo's life is something that almost never exists. Geto is the one person Gojo can actually talk to as a peer. He is Gojo's moral compass, the person who pushes back when Gojo's instincts run cold or careless, the person who keeps Gojo connected to something human when his power would otherwise let him float completely above the ordinary world. Their assignment during the hidden inventory arc is to escort a young girl named Riko Amanai, the star plasma vessel, to a destination where she is supposed to merge with an immortal entity called Master Tengen. This merger is essential to keeping Tengen stable and preventing a catastrophe for the jujutsu world. The mission is important, the stakes are real, and both Gojo and Geto are thrown into situations far more dangerous than anything their rank should expose them to. The person hired to stop them is Toji Fushiguro, a man with no cursed energy at all, who is so physically extraordinary that he defeats both Gojo and Geto. Not once, but across multiple encounters. Gojo is brought to the edge of death. Geto watches someone he is supposed to protect get killed, despite everything he tried to do to prevent it. Riko Amanai dies. The mission fails in the most direct way possible. And then, to make it worse, the group that arranged her assassination, the Star Religious Group, celebrates her death publicly, applauding it as a victory in front of the two boys who just watched a child die trying to protect her. For Gojo, this experience is the catalyst for a breakthrough. He nearly dies, and in that near-death moment, he unlocks the deeper level of his abilities. He comes back from the edge stronger than he was before. The trauma of the mission is real, but his particular kind of strength allows him to metabolize it in a way that produces growth rather than collapse. He grieves Rico. He is furious about what happened, but he survives it intact enough to move forward. For Gojo, the same experience lands completely differently. Gojo is not someone whose strength insulates him from the weight of what he carries. He is empathetic in a way that Gojo is not. He feels the cost of being a sorcerer in his body and his mind in a way that the series shows very clearly. He has been the one doing emotional labor for both of them for years. He is the moral compass, the one who keeps Gojo grounded, the one who processes the harder questions about what they are doing and why. That labor has always been invisible in the way emotional labor tends to be invisible. Gojo did not see it as labor. He saw Gojo as a person who was naturally well-adjusted and ethically clear, not as a person who was working very hard to stay that way while also carrying the weight of everything around him. After Rico's death, something in Gojo begins to shift. He starts asking questions he did not ask before. The mission was to protect someone who had no ability to protect herself. They failed. The people who arranged that failure celebrated it openly and faced no consequences. The Jujutsu world, the system they are both part of, allowed this to happen because it served institutional interests. Gojo begins to feel the thing that anyone with a conscience eventually feels when they spend enough time inside a broken system, that they are being used, that their sacrifice and their suffering and their commitment are feeding a machine that does not care whether they live or die, that the people they are dying to protect do not even know they exist and would not care if they did. He does not say all of this to Gojo immediately. He processes it internally, which is what Gojo does. He is not a person who falls apart loudly. He falls apart quietly, over time, in the space between conversations. And Gojo, who is now becoming more powerful by the month, who is developing in directions that put genuine distance between him and everyone else, does not fully track what is happening in that quiet space. A year after the events of the Hidden Inventory arc, Gojo massacres an entire village. He kills over 100 non-sorcerers. He frames it as a mercy. The village had been persecuting two young sorcerers, twins named Nanako and Mimiko, and Gojo responds to that persecution by destroying the people responsible for it. But the act itself reveals how far his thinking has traveled from where it started. He has moved from protecting sorcerers within the existing system to deciding that the existing system and the non-sorcerers who benefit from it without contributing to it are the problem. He is expelled from Jujutsu High and labeled a curse user. Gojo confronts him. They talk. And in that confrontation, Gojo is forced to face something that his power cannot fix. He cannot reason Gojo back from the edge he has already crossed. He cannot undo the year of internal deterioration that led to this moment. He cannot offer Gojo an alternative that Gojo has not already considered and rejected. He wants to kill Gojo, prepares to do it, and cannot. He lets him go. Because Gojo is his one and only best friend, and killing him is something Gojo's strength is equal to, but his heart is not. This is the part of the story that most analysis focuses on. The tragedy of two people who loved each other being separated by choices that could not be undone. The grief of it is real, and the story earns it completely. What gets less attention is the question of whether any of this was inevitable. Gojo's descent did not happen overnight. It happened across a period of months, maybe longer, during which the signs were present for anyone close enough to see them. He was asking different questions. He was quieter in ways that were different from his normal quiet. He was carrying something that he was not putting down, and the weight of it was changing how he stood. These are the kinds of shifts that the people closest to someone can see if they are paying attention with full presence rather than comfortable assumption. Gojo was not paying attention in that way. Not because he did not care. He cared enormously, as the confrontation scene proves beyond any doubt, but because his growing power had created a kind of distance between him and everyone else that was structural rather than personal. He was becoming too strong to need anyone in the functional sense, and that needlessness was quietly dissolving his ability to be fully present with another person's inner life. He could see Gojo's surface. He could not feel what was happening underneath it. The insight that the story gives us, slowly, through the way it builds the Hidden Inventory arc and its aftermath, is that Gojo's isolation is not just an emotional state. It is a direct consequence of becoming the most powerful person alive. When you reach a level where no one can hurt you and no one operates on your plane, you lose the natural friction of genuine vulnerability. You stop needing to be saved, which means you stop being fully present with other people's experience of needing to be saved. Gojo needed someone to save him, not from a curse or a curse user, but from the thing that was happening inside his own mind. And the one person in the world closest to him was too far above the ground to reach down far enough. Now look at what Gojo builds after Gojo is gone. He becomes a teacher. He takes on students. He builds relationships with young people who are going through their own versions of what Gojo went through. The psychological weight of existing in a world that is trying to kill them. The moral cost of the things they have to do. The loneliness silliness of carrying burdens that most people cannot understand. He cares about these students genuinely. He protects them fiercely, and he builds his relationships with them on exactly the same structural foundation that his relationship with Gojo was built on. He is powerful, and they are not. He is above them in every measurable way, and they know it, and he knows it. He cannot be hurt by what they can be hurt by, and so he cannot fully feel the weight of what they carry. He is present for the dramatic moments, and absent, or emotionally unavailable, for the quiet ones. He assumes they are handling what they are handling because they are still standing, the same way he assumed Gojo was handling what he was handling because Gojo was still standing. He does not learn the lesson that Geto's fall was trying to teach him, or rather, he learns a version of it that is incomplete. He learns that he needs to protect young sorcerers from the institutional violence of the jujutsu world. He does not learn that he needs to be present with them in a different and deeper way than his power naturally allows. He does not learn that the distance his strength creates is itself a danger to the people he loves, because it means he will always be slightly too far away when the quiet deterioration begins. Megumi spends a decade becoming someone who volunteers himself to die, and does not think there is anything wrong with that. Yuji spends the series carrying guilt in quantities that would collapse most people, carrying it alone, in the way his environment has taught him to carry things. The pattern that produced Gojo is alive and running in Gojo's classroom. Different people, different circumstances, same structural gap. He loved Gojo. He loves his students. The love has never been the problem. The problem is what love without full presence looks like when the person who needs you is falling apart quietly, in the space between the moments you actually show up for. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And if this pattern, this specific repeating failure to truly see the people closest to him, is the wound at the center of everything Gojo does as a mentor, then the Shibuya incident is where that wound finally produces its most devastating consequence. Because what happens in Shibuya is not just a battle that goes wrong. It is the moment when everything Gojo built and everything he left unbuilt gets tested against reality all at once. Section 7. His absence. During the Shibuya incident was the single most destructive mentoring failure in the series. October 31st, 2018. That is the date the jujutsu world falls apart. Not gradually, not over weeks of escalating conflict, but in a single night. One evening in Shibuya, Tokyo, where thousands of civilians are trapped inside a barrier, and the sorcerers responsible for protecting them are thrown into a war they are not prepared for, against enemies they cannot match, without the one person whose presence would have changed everything. The plan to seal Gojo is not something that happened by accident or opportunism. Kenjaku, the villain orchestrating the Shibuya incident, has been building toward this specific moment for a very long time. He understands, with complete clarity, that Gojo is the single most important factor in any calculation about the future of the jujutsu world. As long as Gojo exists and is free to act, no large-scale plan to reshape that world can succeed. Gojo is too powerful to defeat directly. Even the strongest cursed spirits in the series, working together, cannot beat him in a straight fight. Jogo, who is established as the most powerful of the unregistered special-grade cursed spirits, is destroyed by Gojo so completely and so casually during their first encounter that it reads almost like a demonstration rather than a battle. So Kenjaku does not try to beat Gojo, he tries to remove him, and the method he chooses is not a weapon or a technique, it is a memory. The prison realm is a special-grade cursed object that can seal anything inside it permanently. To activate it, the target needs to remain within a 4-meter range of the object for roughly a minute while the gate is open. Against someone like Gojo, keeping him in one place for 60 seconds is essentially impossible through force alone. He is too fast, too aware, too powerful to be held still against his will, but he can be made to hold still himself. When Kenjaku reveals himself in Shibuya, he is wearing the face and body of Suguru Geto. The real Geto is dead. Gojo killed him at the end of the events of Jujutsu Kaisen 0, after Yuta left Geto critically injured. Kenjaku, whose ability allows him to inhabit other people's bodies and use their abilities, took over Geto's body after that death, and has been operating inside it ever since. This means that the person standing in front of Gojo in Shibuya looks exactly like his dead best friend. The one person Gojo loved as an equal, the one loss that broke something in him that never fully healed. Gojo recognizes with his eyes that this is not the real Geto. His 6 eyes, the ability that gives him extraordinary perception, can read cursed energy signatures, and the cursed energy in front of him does not match Geto's. He knows intellectually that this is not his friend, but the sight of that face, that body, that specific presence that meant more to him than almost anything in the world, that hits somewhere below intellect. He hesitates, not for long, a fraction of a second in real time, but within his own mind, the place where his perception operates, it registers as a minute's worth of processing time. That is all the prison realm needs. The gate closes, Gojo is sealed, and Shibuya is left left without the strongest sorcerer alive for the rest of the night. What follows is among the most devastating sequences in the entire series. The sorcerers who remain, Nanami, Yuji, Nobara, Megumi, Naobito Zenin, Maki, and others, fight with everything they have. They are genuinely courageous. Several of them perform at levels that should not be possible for people their age or their grade. They hold things together in ways that are remarkable given what they are facing. It is not enough. It was never going to be enough. Thousands of lives are lost in a single night. Shibuya is decimated. Mahito, one of the series' most terrifying cursed spirits, goes essentially unchecked and inflicts damage that is not just physical but psychological. The things he does to the sorcerers he encounters during Shibuya leave marks that the survivors carry for the rest of the series. Nanami, one of the steadiest and most capable sorcerers in the story, dies. Nobara is left in a state so dire that her survival is genuinely uncertain for a long stretch of the story afterward. Yuji is made to watch things he cannot unhappen, forced into situations where he is responsible for deaths he could not prevent, and exits Shibuya carrying a weight of guilt that the series does not pretend is light. And Megumi, who fights through the entire night trying to hold things together, does so while knowing that the person who was supposed to be the immovable foundation of their world is gone. None of this is Gojo's fault in the direct sense. He did not choose to be sealed. He did not walk into Shibuya intending for things to go this way. The plan to trap him was sophisticated, patient, and built specifically around the one vulnerability that his power could not defend against: his grief. You cannot blame someone for being hurt by the thing they love most, but you can ask a different question. You can ask whether a mentor who had truly prepared his students for his own absence would have left them this exposed. Because the sealing of Gojo reveals something that should have been addressed long before October 31st arrived. His students, and the sorcerers who operate in the world he has shaped, have no plan for a world without him. His presence is so total and so assumed that when it disappears, the entire structure collapses. There is no backup. There is no distributed system of strength that can fill even a fraction of the gap. There is no protocol for what happens when the one person holding everything together is suddenly gone. There is just absence and the chaos that rushes in to fill it. A mentor who understood the full weight of his responsibility would have built for this possibility. Not because it was likely. Before Shibuya, the idea of removing Gojo from the board seemed almost theoretical to most people in the jujutsu world, but because the possibility was always there. Gojo himself knows he is not invincible in every sense. He knows that his power, extraordinary as it is, has limits. He knows that the enemies aligned against him are intelligent and patient, and have been looking for ways around his strength for years. The prison realm is not a secret that fell from the sky on October 31st. The knowledge that cursed objects capable of sealing someone exist is part of the jujutsu world's history. He did not prepare his students for his absence. He prepared them to be stronger. Those are different things. There is also a more specific failure embedded in the Shibuya incident that is easy to overlook in the scale of the catastrophe. Gojo is lured into Shibuya in the first place because civilians are being held hostage inside the barrier. Non-sorcerers, people with no ability to defend themselves, are being used as leverage to force Gojo into a situation his enemies have designed around him. He goes because he cannot not go. Leaving civilians to die is not something Gojo is capable of doing, and Kenjaku knows this and uses it. This is a predictable vulnerability, not a character flaw. Choosing to protect innocent people is not a flaw, but it is a pattern that anyone paying attention to Gojo's values for long enough could have anticipated and planned around. The enemies did anticipate it. They built their entire strategy around it. The people on Gojo's side, including the students and allies he has spent years operating alongside, did not have a counter strategy in place for the scenario where Gojo's own values are used as the mechanism of his removal. That gap between what the enemies understood about Gojo and what his own side had planned for is a mentoring failure in the deepest sense. A mentor who had fully prepared the people around him would have made sure they had contingencies. He would have had conversations at some point across the years of his teaching career about what happens if he is not there. He would have made sure that the world he was protecting did not rest entirely on his continued presence. He would have built something that could survive without him. He built himself. He built his students to be strong. He did not build a system. The aftermath of Shibuya makes this even more painful to watch. With Gojo sealed, the higher-ups move immediately to capitalize on the chaos. They issue death sentences for Yuji, revoke the suspension of his execution, reinstate Geto's death sentence, sentence Principal Yaga to death, and officially exile Gojo from Jujutsu Society while he remains sealed. Every protection Gojo had placed around the people he cared about evaporates the moment he is no longer physically present to enforce it. The shield he provided was entirely personal. It existed because he was there. When he is not there, it does not exist. Yaga, the principal of Jujutsu High, and the man who taught Gojo himself is killed. He is cornered by the higher-ups and forced into a situation that ends in his death, and it happens in the window created by Gojo's absence. The people who had been kept in line by the implicit threat of Gojo's disapproval are no longer kept in line by anything. Yuji exits Shibuya and walks directly into a world that has decided he should be dead. Megumi exits Shibuya and faces the Zenin clan, the institution that has controlled and damaged his family for generations, without the person who had spent a decade making sure they could not touch him. Yuta, who is not in Shibuya, is tasked with being Yuji's executioner, told by the higher-ups to kill the person who is supposed to be one of his closest allies, in a world that has suddenly lost its protector. The students who were supposed to be the next generation of a better jujutsu world are left, in the immediate aftermath of Gojo's sealing, to survive a jujutsu world that is actively trying to kill them. And the tools Gojo gave them, individual strength, resilience, the ability to fight, are genuinely valuable, but completely insufficient for the scale of what they are now navigating. They survive. That is the thing about Gojo's students. They are extraordinary people who find ways to survive things that should not be survivable. But surviving is not the same as being prepared. Getting through something is not the same as having been given what you needed to face it. They make it through the other side of Shibuya and its aftermath because of who they are, not because of what they were given. Gojo placed himself at the center of everything and did not build anything that could stand without him. That is not the legacy of a great mentor. That is the legacy of someone who was irreplaceable in the worst possible sense. Not because what he offered was so unique that no one else could provide it, but because he never tried to make himself replaceable. He never asked what happens to the people I love when I am gone, and then actually built the answer. What makes this even harder to sit with is that Gojo's emotional unavailability, the same distance that let Geto fall, the same gap that meant his students were isolated inside their strength, is exactly the vulnerability that Kenjaku exploits to seal him. The grief over Geto that Gojo never fully processed, the loss he carried forward without ever really putting down, is the crack in the wall. It is the one place where something can get through. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Which means the same wound that damaged his students is also the wound that took him off the board entirely. And once Gojo is gone, what is left is a group of young people who were never truly taught how to function without him, which is a problem that goes far deeper than tactics or battle strategy. It is a problem of who they were taught to be, and whether that was ever really about them. Section 8. He was emotionally unavailable in the precise ways his students needed. There is a moment in Jujutsu Kaisen 0 that gets remembered for the wrong reason. Yuta Okotsu is new to Jujutsu High. He has come from a life of complete isolation because the cursed spirit of his childhood best friend Rika has been attached to him and has been attacking anyone who gets near him. Before Gojo intervenes, Yuta has accepted that he should be executed. He is not fighting for his life. He has decided his life is too dangerous to other people to be worth keeping. He is 15 years old, and he has already concluded that the world would be better without him in it. When Gojo first speaks to Yuta about Rika, he describes the curse as the manifestation of a twisted form of love. He tells Yuta that Rika's attachment to him is essentially a curse born from love that could not let go. That is a meaningful insight. It is also delivered with the same casual confidence that Gojo brings to everything, as though it is simply an observation he is making, rather than something he understands might be devastating to hear. He calls Yuta gloomy for hating his own power. The word is not cruel in Gojo's mind. He is trying in his way to push Yuta past self-pity towards something more functional. But what Yuta needed in that moment was not a push. He needed someone to sit with him in the reality of what he was going through before asking him to move past it. Gojo does not sit with people. That is the honest truth at the center of this section. He moves, he acts, he pushes forward and upward, and he brings enormous energy and warmth and care to the people around him. But the specific thing that the young people in his life needed most, the experience of having someone stay still with them in their pain without immediately trying to fix it or reframe it or move them towards something more useful, is the thing Gojo consistently cannot provide. This is not a personality quirk. It is the direct result of how Gojo survived his own life. He was separated from his parents as a child and trained to develop his abilities. The people who held authority over him as he grew up did not treat him as a person who needed emotional care. They treated him as a resource that needed to be developed. Nobody sat with young Gojo in his fear or his loneliness or his exhaustion. What was modeled for him from the very beginning was that you process what you are going through internally. You get stronger and you keep moving. You do not stop. Stopping means the weight catches up with you. And if you have never been taught how to carry weight properly, stopping feels like being buried. So he did not stop. He got stronger instead. And strength, for Gojo, became the answer to everything, including things that strength cannot actually answer. The specific ways this emotional unavailability shows up in his relationships with his students are precise enough to trace one by one, and each one reveals a different dimension of the same underlying gap. With Yuta, the gap shows up immediately. Gojo recognizes Yuta's potential and moves quickly to develop it. He places Yuta with other students, Panda, Maki, and Toge, understanding that Yuta needs human connection and that Gojo himself is not the right source of that connection. This is, as noted in earlier sections, a real moment of self-awareness. Gojo knows he is not equipped to provide everything Yuta needs. He outsources appropriately. But there is something he does not outsource, because he does not recognize it as a gap. He does not empathize with Yuta about what it feels like to hate the power you were born with. His own experience of his power has never been one of hatred. Even as a young student, even before he fully developed his abilities, Gojo was confident in what he was. He did not go through a period of wishing he was someone else, of feeling like his own existence was a danger to everyone he loved. Yuta's specific experience of his power as something monstrous, as something that has already hurt people, as something he would rather not have, is genuinely foreign to Gojo, and because it is foreign, he cannot meet Yuta there. He can only try to move Yuta toward a relationship with his power that looks more like Gojo's own relationship with his power, which means he is, once again, trying to help by making someone more like himself, rather than by truly seeing what that person actually needs. With Megumi, the gap shows up in every private interaction they have. Gojo holds high expectations for Megumi and makes sure Megumi knows it. He reminds Megumi of his potential. He keeps the pressure high in their relationship in a way that is constant and consistent across years. He does not ask Megumi how he is doing in the sense of genuinely wanting to know the answer and being prepared to sit with whatever that answer is. The care flows in one direction, from Gojo's vision of what Megumi will become toward Megumi's present reality. And that direction means Megumi is always being measured against a future self, rather than being seen as the person he is right now. Megumi, who has been abandoned and neglected in his actual family life. His father sold him to the Zenin clan before Gojo intervened, and his mother is not in the picture, has a specific and deep wound around not being enough as he is. He needed someone to look at him and say that who he is right now, without any future potential attached to it, is enough. Gojo never quite says that. He says Megumi could surpass him. He says Megumi has extraordinary potential. He says, in the language of his expectations, that Megumi matters enormously. But the mattering is always conditional on what Megumi will become, not unconditional about who Megumi already is. That specific distinction between conditional and unconditional regard is one of the most important things a mentor can get right or wrong for a student who is already carrying a wound around not being enough. Gojo gets it wrong with Megumi not out of carelessness, but out of genuine blindness to the distinction. For Gojo, potential is how you show someone you believe in them. He does not see that for someone like Megumi. Being seen in terms of potential can feel like being told you do not quite measure up yet. With Yuji, the emotional unavailability takes its most visible and most documented form in the fake death incident. After Yuji appears to die following his first encounter with Sukuna taking over his body, Gojo makes a decision. He tells Megumi and Nobara that Yuji is dead. He allows them to grieve. He does not tell them the truth, that Yuji is alive, that the death was not real, until a month later, during the Kyoto Goodwill event, when he orchestrates a reveal in which Yuji jumps out of a box and surprises them. Megumi and Nobara are not impressed. They are upset. They have spent a month believing their friend is dead, processing that loss, carrying the weight of it. And then they are told that the whole thing was a management decision, that keeping the information from them was a choice someone made for strategic reasons, without considering what it would cost them emotionally. Gojo's reasoning is not entirely without logic. Keeping Yuji's survival a secret was a way of protecting him from the higher-ups who wanted him executed. If fewer people knew he was alive, the information was less likely to leak. There is a practical argument available, but practical arguments and good mentorship are not always the same thing, and this is one of the clearest examples in the series of Gojo choosing the practical calculation over the emotional reality of the people in his care. He did not tell Megumi and Nobara because he did not fully account for what it costs a person to grieve someone they love, even if that grief turns out to be temporary. He treated their emotional experience as something that could be corrected after the fact. Surprise, he is alive. Grief resolved. Without understanding that grief does not work that way. You cannot undo a month of loss with a punchline. The month happened. The wait was real. The experience of believing someone you cared about was gone forever changed something in Megumi and Nobara that a cheerful reveal could not simply undo. This incident is not the worst thing Gojo does, but it is one of the most revealing because it shows exactly how he processes the emotional lives of the people around him. He manages them. He makes decisions about them. He treats their feelings as variables to be handled rather than realities to be honored. And he does this not because he does not care, but because he genuinely does not have a complete model for what honoring someone else's emotional reality looks like. The pattern across all three of his primary students is identical at its core. Yuta needs someone to meet him in his self-hatred, and Gojo redirects him toward usefulness. Megumi needs someone to see him without conditions, and Gojo sees him in terms of potential. Yuji needs someone to trust him with difficult information, and Gojo decides what he can handle and withholds the rest. In each case, Gojo is present, caring, and genuinely invested in the outcome. In each case, the specific form of presence that student needed most is the form Gojo cannot quite deliver. What all three students actually needed, underneath the training and the protection and the expectations, was simple in theory and clearly very difficult in practice. They needed someone to look at them in the specific moment they were in, carrying the specific weight they were carrying, and say, "I see what this is costing you, and you do not have to pretend it is not." Gojo could not say that. Not because it was not true. He could see that things cost his students in his own way. But saying it out loud, staying in that space with them, allowing the difficulty to exist without immediately moving toward fixing it or reframing it or pushing them through it, that required a kind of emotional stillness that his entire life had trained him away from. He was the strongest person in the world. He had spent that strength protecting his students from physical danger, institutional violence, and the worst of what the jujutsu world wanted to do to them. He poured that strength into keeping them alive and making them powerful, and holding the space around them so that they could develop into the people he believed they could become. And in the quiet moments, the ones that did not require strength at all, just presence, he was somewhere else. Not physically, in every other way that mattered. The saddest part of this is that Gojo clearly felt things deeply. His grief over Geto was real and lifelong. His love for his students was genuine and visible. He was not a cold person underneath the armor. He was a person who had built very good armor and genuinely forgotten, somewhere along the way, how to take it off when the people he loved needed him without it. His students built their own armor, in his image. And what that armor cost them is something the series spends enormous time showing, because it is central to what Jujutsu Kaisen is actually about beneath all the fighting. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But even with all of that, the absence, the philosophy, the emotional unavailability, the way he shaped his students around his own needs and his own grief, there is still one failure left that puts everything else in context. Because all of the damage this section describes was felt by individuals, one student at a time. The next failure is about something structural. Something Gojo built, or rather failed to build, that meant every single person who depended on him was exposed at once. It is the failure that sits underneath all the others, and it is the one that reveals exactly what kind of plan Gojo actually had, and what was always missing from it. Section 9. His reform plan had no contingency for his own removal. Every plan has a center, the thing the whole structure is built around, the piece that everything else depends on to function. When that center holds, the plan works. When it does not, everything built around it falls apart at once, not piece by piece, but all together, in the same moment, because nothing was ever built to stand on its own. Gojo's plan to reform the jujutsu world had a center. That center was Gojo. This is not a harsh reading of his intentions. It is just a description of how the plan actually worked in practice. Gojo decided, after losing Geto and confronting the corruption of the jujutsu establishment, that he would change the system by raising a new generation of powerful sorcerers who shared his values. He would protect them from the higher-ups who wanted to use or destroy them. He would make them strong enough that eventually, when the time came, they could take their place as the leaders of a different and better jujutsu world. That was the plan, stated clearly enough in the series that there is no ambiguity about it. What the plan required, at every stage, was Gojo being present and free to act. His protection of Yuji only worked because the higher-ups were afraid of him. His ability to override institutional decisions about his students only existed because he was too powerful to be challenged directly. His influence over the direction of Jujutsu High as an institution only functioned because his presence gave him leverage that nobody was willing to push against. Every protection he had built around the people he cared about was personal. It was his. It existed because he was there, and it existed only as long as he was there. This is the definition of a plan with no contingency. A contingency is what happens when the thing you most depend on is suddenly not available. It is the answer to the question, what do we do if this goes wrong? Every serious plan for anything that matters has to account for the possibility that its most critical element might fail, or be removed, or become unavailable at exactly the wrong moment. The more important that critical element is, the more essential it is to have a real answer to that question. Because the more the plan depends on one thing, the more catastrophic it is when that one thing disappears. Gojo's reform plan depended entirely on him. He had no real answer to the question of what happens if he is removed. Not because the question never occurred to him, he showed some awareness that his absence could be dangerous, which is why he arranged for Yuta to protect Yuji if something happened. But one person being designated to protect one other person is not a contingency plan. It is one small patch on a structure that had no foundation beyond Gojo himself. To understand how complete this failure is, it helps to trace exactly what disappeared the moment Gojo was sealed in the prison realm on October 31st. Yuji Itadori had been kept alive specifically because Gojo wanted him alive, and the higher-ups were not willing to move against Gojo's wishes. That protection was entirely personal. The moment Gojo was sealed, the higher-ups reinstated Yuji's death sentence immediately. Not after deliberation, not after some period of reconsidering whether Yuji had proven his worth. Immediately. Because the thing preventing them from doing it was gone, and there was nothing structural in place to replace it. No law had been changed, no institutional policy had shifted, no system had been built that would protect Yuji regardless of whether Gojo was standing in the room. Principal Yaga was sentenced to death. Yaga was the man who had run Jujutsu High, who had trained Gojo himself, who had protected students and kept the school functioning as something close to a sanctuary in a Jujutsu world that treated sorcerers as expendable. His connection to Gojo and to Geto was used as justification for his execution. He died because the higher-ups, freed from the constraint of Gojo's presence, moved against him the moment they could. He had no protection that survived Gojo's removal. Everything that had kept him safe was downstream of Gojo existing and being free. Geto's death sentence, which had been in suspension since his death years earlier, was somehow reinstated as a political move against the people connected to him. The higher-ups used the Shibuya incident, which Kenjaku had orchestrated using Geto's body without Geto's consent or knowledge, as an excuse to brand everyone connected to Gojo and Geto as criminals. Gojo was exiled from Jujutsu Society while sealed, a move that was entirely symbolic but revealed exactly how thoroughly the protective structure he had built was personal rather than institutional. Exile Gojo, and the protection he provided evaporates as though it never existed. Yuta Okotsu, who Gojo had saved from execution at the beginning of the series, was placed in the position of being ordered to execute Yuji. The higher-ups knew that Yuta was one of the few sorcerers powerful enough to actually carry out the order. They also knew that putting Yuta in that position created a crisis for Gojo's allies, forcing them to either comply with institutional authority or resist it, which was exactly the kind of division that benefited the people trying to consolidate control. Gojo had protected Yuta from the institution. He had not built anything that prevented the institution from turning Yuta into an instrument against other people Gojo cared about. Every single one of these outcomes was predictable. Not in the sense that anyone could have known Gojo would be sealed on exactly that night in exactly that way, but in the sense that anyone thinking seriously about what would happen if Gojo's protection was suddenly removed could have mapped out, well in advance, what the higher-ups would do the moment they had the freedom to do it. The higher-ups had been trying to control, neutralize, or destroy the people around Gojo for years. Their intentions were not hidden. Their patterns were not ambiguous. They moved against sorcerers they considered inconvenient every time the opportunity presented itself. The only thing stopping them from doing it to Gojo's students was Gojo. He knew this. He had been the thing stopping them for years, consciously and deliberately. He understood that the higher-ups were dangerous to the people he protected. Understanding that, and then not building anything that would protect those people in his absence, is a failure of planning that is very hard to explain charitably. The most generous explanation is that Gojo genuinely believed his sealing or removal was unlikely enough that building a full contingency was not a priority. He was, after all, essentially undefeatable in direct combat. The scenario where he was neutralized required a specific combination of a rare and powerful cursed object, a sophisticated long-term plan by an extremely intelligent enemy, and the exploitation of his one emotional vulnerability. None of those elements were obvious in advance. You could argue that planning for a scenario that specific would have been like planning for being struck by lightning, but that argument collapses when you consider who Gojo was dealing with. Kenjaku is one of the most patient and strategically brilliant enemies in the series. He has been alive for over 1,000 years, moving between bodies, accumulating knowledge, and working toward goals that span generations. He had already demonstrated, through the events involving Geto and the broader conspiracy that led to Shibuya, that he was thinking years and decades ahead. Gojo knew Kenjaku existed. He knew the threat was real and sophisticated and long-term. Treating his own removal as too unlikely to plan for, given the nature of the enemy he was dealing with, reflects either extreme overconfidence or a failure to think the problem all the way through. Both of those things are consistent with how Gojo operates throughout the series. His confidence in his own power is enormous, and in combat terms, largely justified. But that confidence bleeds into his planning in ways that are not justified. He trusts himself to handle whatever comes up. He trusts his own presence to be the answer. He does not fully sit with the question of what happens when he is the problem rather than the solution, when his absence is the crisis rather than his presence being the cure. There is also a deeper structural issue that goes beyond the immediate political fallout of his sealing. Gojo's reform plan was generational. He was raising people who would eventually change the system. But generational change requires institutions, not just individuals. You cannot reform a corrupt structure by producing a new generation of powerful people, and then leaving that generation to to navigate the same corrupt structure without any institutional changes to support them. Power without structure is just a new set of powerful people operating inside an old, broken system. Gojo made his students powerful. He did not build institutions. He did not change laws. He did not create systems that would distribute the protection he provided across structures that could survive without him. He did not build alliances with people outside the higher-ups who could provide institutional resistance if he was removed. He used his personal power to hold space for a better future, and did not ask the harder question of what that better future needed to be built on beyond him. The people who run corrupt institutions know one thing very well. Powerful individuals can be removed. What is harder to remove is a system. You can seal one person. You cannot seal a changed law, an established coalition, a distributed network of people and structures all working toward the same goal through mechanisms that do not depend on any single person being present. Gojo's enemies understood this better than Gojo did. They built a plan that removed him as a person, knowing that removing him as a person was sufficient to collapse everything he had built. That tells you everything about what he built and what he left unbuilt. His students survived. They are remarkable people, and they found ways through circumstances that should have destroyed them. Yuji, Megumi, Yuta, they keep going in the aftermath of Shibuya with a kind of stubborn resilience that is genuinely moving. But they do it without the support structure their mentor was supposed to be building for them all along. They do it in a jujutsu world that is actively hostile to their existence. They do it by leaning on each other, on people outside Gojo's immediate circle, on the lessons they learn from sources other than their teacher. There is something both admirable and painful about watching Gojo's students outlast the plan that was supposed to protect them. Admirable because their strength is real and their choices are genuinely brave. Painful because none of it was supposed to be this hard. The plan was supposed to be building towards something that made their lives safer and more supported over time. Instead, the plan collapsed the moment its center was removed, and the people it was supposed to protect were left to survive the collapse on their own. A great mentor builds something that outlasts them. A mentor who has truly done their job can step back, or be forced back, or removed entirely, and see the people they trained continue to move forward because the foundation they built was solid enough to stand on its own. What Gojo built was a wall, strong, impressive, necessary while it stood, and entirely dependent on him to keep standing. When the wall came down, what was left behind was a group of young people who had been trained to be strong, trained to be independent, trained to believe in themselves, and who were now facing the full weight of a broken world with none of the institutional support that strength and independence and self-belief cannot substitute for. They deserved better than a wall. They deserved a foundation. And the difference between those two things is the difference between someone who was protecting people for as long as he was around and someone who was actually building something for them to stand on long after he was gone. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That gap between protecting and building runs through everything Gojo did as a mentor. But nowhere is it more visible in its human cost than in the final measure of what his teaching actually produced. Not in battle records or power levels, but in the people who walked out the other side of his influence and what they were carrying, and what they were missing, and what it cost them to get as far as they did. Section 10. He made great sorcerers and damaged people. Here is the thing about Satoru Gojo that makes this entire conversation complicated. He was not wrong about his students. Yuji Itadori becomes one of the most powerful and morally grounded fighters in the series. He develops his physical abilities to a level that puts him in conversation with threats that should be completely beyond someone his age and experience. More than that, he holds on to his humanity through circumstances that would strip most people of theirs. He watches people die. He carries Sukuna inside him and feels what Sukuna does with his body. He goes through Shibuya and comes out the other side still believing that people deserve to be protected, still choosing to put himself between others and the things trying to hurt them. As a sorcerer, as a fighter, as someone built to operate in the jujutsu world, Yuji is remarkable. Megumi Fushiguro develops his 10 Shadows technique to a level that Sukuna himself considers worth taking. Sukuna is the most powerful being in the series, a cursed spirit so far above ordinary sorcerers that most of them cannot meaningfully interact with him as a threat. For Sukuna to look at a teenager and decide that his specific ability is worth possessing, worth the catastrophic act of taking over his body entirely, is a statement about the level Megumi reaches. By the cold measure of power and ability, Megumi is extraordinary. Yuta Okotsu arrives at Jujutsu High as a boy who has decided he should be dead and leaves as a special grade sorcerer, one of only 4 people in the entire Jujutsu world to hold that designation. He develops at a speed that even Gojo finds notable. He becomes capable of things that place him among the most powerful sorcerers alive. He also becomes genuinely brave, genuinely connected to the people around him, and genuinely committed to the values his mentor tried to build into him. By any metric that measures sorcerers, Gojo produced extraordinary results. The machinery worked. The training, however inconsistent and however full of gaps, pointed his students in directions that led to real and remarkable power. If you are measuring a mentor purely by the combat ability of the people they trained, Gojo scores near the top. But measuring a mentor purely by the combat ability of their students is like measuring a parent purely by how much money their children earn. It captures something real while missing most of what matters. Yuji Itadori describes himself multiple times across the series as a cog, a replaceable piece in a machine that needs him to perform a specific function. He frames his own existence in terms of what he is useful for: consuming Sukuna's fingers, giving people proper deaths, being the vessel that makes the endgame possible. This is a 15-year-old boy describing himself as a tool, not because he is incapable of seeing his own worth in other terms, but because the framework he was handed from the moment he entered the jujutsu world defined him by his function. He was kept alive because he was useful. He was trained because the training served the plan. He was protected because his protection served the larger goal. He took that framework and, in the extraordinary way that Yuji does everything, made it into something beautiful. He decided that if he was going to be used by the world, he was going to use that position to protect as many people as possible. He turned an external definition of his worth into an internal commitment to other people's well-being. The grace with which he does this is one of the most moving things about him as a character. It does not change what he was handed, and it does not change what carrying it costs him. Yuji exits the Shibuya incident carrying guilt that the series does not soften or rush past. He is made to participate in deaths he could not prevent, forced into situations where Sukuna uses his body to cause devastation while Yuji watches from inside, unable to stop it. The psychological weight of that experience is treated seriously by the story. It is not a plot point that gets resolved in 2 episodes. It sits in Yuji and changes how he moves through the world. He becomes someone who has seen what he is capable of, or rather what the thing living inside him is capable of, and has to find a way to keep going as himself after that. He does find a way, but he finds it largely without the support structure a mentor was supposed to provide. He finds it through the people around him, through Todo, through the relationships he has built with other students, through his own deep and seemingly bottomless reserves of the will to keep going. What he does not find it through is Gojo, because Gojo is sealed, and because even when Gojo was present, the specific kind of support Yuji needed was not what Gojo knew how to give. Megumi's damage is quieter and, in some ways, more complete. He goes through the entire series carrying a self-sacrificing pattern that the story treats as increasingly dangerous. He decides, in the Goodwill event, to use his most powerful and most dangerous technique against a single opponent when that choice could easily have killed him. He frames the decision as tactical. It is not purely tactical. It is the behavior of someone who has been taught, over years, to weigh his own survival against the outcome and find his own survival to be the less important variable. This pattern does not stay contained to tactical decisions. It runs through everything Megumi does. His relationship with his sister Tsumiki, which he carries with almost no support from anyone, in complete silence, is the emotional parallel of his tactical choices. He takes the full weight of her situation onto himself. He does not reach for help. He does not let other people share the load. He holds everything alone, because holding things alone is what he has been shaped to do. The outcome of all this is what happens at the end of his arc. Sukuna takes over Megumi's body in a way that is permanent enough to remove Megumi from the story as an active participant for an extended and devastating stretch of the narrative. The mechanism Sukuna uses is connected directly to the 10 Shadows technique and to the psychological state Megumi is in at the time, a state of grief and collapse that leaves him unable to resist. Megumi, the student Gojo invested a decade in and pushed hardest toward greatness, becomes the vehicle for the most catastrophic actions the main villain takes in the latter part of the story. That outcome is not solely Gojo's fault. The series does not frame it that way, and neither should this essay. Megumi makes his own choices. The circumstances that bring him to that breaking point are genuinely horrible in ways that go beyond anything Gojo could have fully prepared him for. But the specific psychological state that makes Megumi vulnerable, the repressed grief, the complete lack of emotional support structures, the deep-rooted belief that his own survival is always the least important variable, those things were built across a decade of mentorship. They did not appear from nowhere. Yuta carries his damage differently. His arrival story is one of the most emotionally raw in the series. A boy so isolated and so convinced of his own danger to others that he has agreed to his own execution. Gojo saves him from that. The salvation is real, and Yuta knows it, and it shapes his fierce loyalty to Gojo throughout everything that follows. But Yuta's core wound, the terror of his own power, the fear of what he might do to people he loves, is something Gojo addresses only partially. He redirects Yuta toward using his power, rather than helping him fully process the experience of having been so afraid of it. The redirection works. The processing is incomplete. Yuta becomes powerful. He also becomes someone whose greatest fear, a across the series is always some version of the same thing, being a danger to people he loves. Gojo told him that Rika's attachment was a twisted form of love turned into a curse. He pointed Yuta toward his power and toward his friendships, and toward the idea that being a sorcerer was a way to use the thing that had isolated him to protect people instead. All of that is good and real, and Yuta genuinely internalizes it. But nobody sat with Yuta in the original wound. Nobody helped him grieve what happened to Rika and what it cost both of them. The wound got redirected, not healed. This is the through line across all three of them. Yuji, Megumi, Yuta. Three extraordinary sorcerers. Three people carrying damage that their training did not address, that their mentor could not see clearly enough to treat, and that the series makes you feel in your chest every time it surfaces. The argument that gets made for Gojo at this point is usually something like, but look what they became. Look at how strong they are. Look at how they survived things that should have destroyed them. Is that not proof that whatever Gojo did worked? It is proof that they survived. It is not proof that what they survived was necessary or acceptable or the best possible outcome. Survival and flourishing are different things. Coming through something and being okay are different things. Gojo's students came through. Whether they are okay is a question the series takes seriously and does not answer cheaply. There is also a specific thing that the strongest students around Gojo develop that reveals the gap in his teaching more clearly than anything else. The people who grow the most, who develop the most completely, who come the closest to being both powerful and whole, they grow through relationships and experiences that Gojo is not part of. Yuji grows most through Todo. Megumi grows through his bond with Yuji and his fight to protect Sumiki. Yuta grows through Rika and through his friendships with Maki, Panda, and Toge. The growth that sticks, the growth that builds character rather than just power, happens in the spaces between the moments Gojo is present for. That is not a coincidence. Gojo's presence, as warm and genuine as it is, carries a weight that actually makes certain kinds of growth harder. When the most powerful person in the world is your teacher, it is difficult to discover your own way of being strong. It is difficult to develop your own philosophy about what strength means and what it is for. The shadow he casts is so large that the people inside it are always partly defined by him, by the distance between where they are and where he is, by the question of whether they are measuring up, by the framework he provides that shapes how they understand the world they are operating inside. The students who grow most completely grow partly by stepping out from under that shadow. Not abandoning Gojo, not rejecting what he gave them, but finding spaces where his framework does not fully apply, and discovering what they think and feel and believe when it is just them. Great mentorship should produce people who are more fully themselves, not people who have to find themselves in the gaps the mentor left. The goal of genuine teaching is to eventually make yourself unnecessary, to build people who do not need you to be who they are, who have internalized what they needed to learn and made it truly their own, and who can then go forward and figure out the rest without you. Gojo students are genuinely capable in that sense. They are strong, they keep going. But the things that are most fully theirs, the things they can claim as genuinely belonging to them, are largely not the things Gojo gave them. They are the things they found or built or discovered in the spaces where Gojo was not quite present enough, not quite available enough, not quite able to see them clearly enough to shape. Gojo made great sorcerers. He made people who could survive the jujutsu world at its worst. That is real, and it matters, and it should not be dismissed. But great sorcerers are not the same as people who are okay. Powerful is not the same as whole. Surviving is not the same as being given what you deserved. His students deserved someone who could build both, the strength and the wholeness, the power and the foundation, the ability to fight and the ability to put the fight down sometimes, and just be a person without it costing them everything they have. Gojo gave them the strength. He could not give them the rest because he had never found it himself. And that, more than any specific failure, more than the absences and the philosophy and the plan and the emotional unavailability, is what sits at the very center of his legacy as a mentor. He gave from what he had. He could not give from what he lacked, and what he lacked was precisely what his students needed most. They became extraordinary. They became damaged. Both of those things are true at the same time, and both of them trace back to the same person, and the same love, and the same deep and genuine and ultimately incomplete effort to give the next generation something better than what he had. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.